would like to welcome all our readers. Today we're with Professor Marilyn Strathern. She's Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Cambridge. Her research career began with work on kinship and gender relations, with emphasis on Melanésia, and she's best known, especially in Brazil, for her book, The Gender of the Gift, published in 1988. Since then, she has conducted anthropological research on new reproductive technologies, legal systems, and intellectual and cultural property, and regimes of audit and accountability. She's also author of the article Vegetative Regeneration, an essay on gender relations, published this year by Man. It's a pleasure to have you here. Please be welcome.
Thank you very much for your welcome. I have to say that the opportunity to be doing this is very rare among the journals I read. And I'm particularly grateful, I have to say, to be conducting this in English. That's really kind of you. And I just wanted to add how lucky I was that Bruno Guimarães did the original translation.
Awesome. I would like to start talking about the first thing I wanted to say about your article. There is a reflection based on various ethnographies in Amazonia and in Melanésia on how anthropological description can be opened up on the basis of forms of plant life. Could you comment on which populations, plants, and ways of relating to them are we talking about?
Well, that's quite an interesting question to start with. Well, given that the plant term in anthropology is really now rather old, there is nothing original for someone like me who never really paid plants much attention to be newly alert. I'm a typical product of 1960s British social anthropology. I focused on the social organization of gardening rather than the plants. But it was, in fact, visiting Papua New Guinea in 2015 and seeing the effects of the drought there. They are used to periods of famine, but this was particularly severe because of climate change and what it was doing to the crops that they plant. And I suddenly saw things, I mean, after all those years, with fresh eyes. It suddenly struck me that living plants required living plants to reproduce. And that got me thinking about reproduction and the cycle of life and death in general. Now, when suddenly plants came into my view, I knew there was a large literature from Melanesia on the analogies that people draw between plant life and human life. Literature that actually spans more than a century, even if one begins only with Malinowski and not before. And of course, it became for me less going back to field notes, which were too patchy, than of pursuing what is there in the ethnographic record. And my Melanesian examples come from diverse times and places. These include the Trobriands, as originally studied in the early 20th century, along with reinterpretations and contemporary observations from the early 21st century. Then I draw on two accounts based on fieldwork in the 1970s and 1980s, although often describing earlier practices. There are countless other instances up to and including the present. But these three yield very explicit exegeses of certain processes of life and death. Now, I've been in retirement now from department and college for 12 years. And something I've been doing since retirement is to try to re-educate myself, including coming to grips with just a tiny portion of the fascinating work that's been going on for years in Amazonia and South America more generally. I wasn't entirely ignorant. I might mention Professor Viveros de Castro's visit to Cambridge in 1998 at the invitation of Stephen Hugh Jones, and another influential colleague of mine has always been the ethnobotanist Françoise Barbera Friedman. But anyway, my reading was finally prompted by a small research project involving both Amerindianists and Melanesianists, and Professor Valença is part of it. Of course, I'd known something of Laura Raval's work for a long time, but Amazonian colleagues here and in Rio now fed me with books and papers, which is how I came to draw on the more recent work of Miller and Maitza. I was interested in people's engagement with root crops. Now, on the Melanesian side, with ancient corms and tubers, the taro is a corm and the yam is a tuber, but also banana, sugarcane, and so forth. Now, on the Amerindian side, there are similar root crops, manioc and potato, as well as yam and taro, but also, of course, other foodstuff such as beans, squash, and maize. But in all these cases, propagation is glossed with parent-child idioms. Now, as Aparecida Valença reminds us, such an intense interest in plants applies to only part of the region, but that in turn, of course, leads into the whole issue of comparison.
Yes, exactly. I was wanting to ask you, why and how can we compare ethnographies of Amazonia and ethnographies of Melanesia?
You're absolutely right to ask that question, because of course I'm not doing cross-cultural comparison in any systematic sense. The axis of comparison is not cross-cultural, so to speak, which has as one of its goals understanding particular cultures better. It's really elsewhere, in fact, in two places. First of all, people's comparisons. What's common to these instances is the ethnographic question. If people think about plants through thinking about persons, what about the ways in which they think about persons through thinking about plants? What can one do with this internal analogy or comparison? And it's there on both the Amazonian and the Melanesian side. What is interesting is that the internal analogy puts a question mark over the terms of analysis. So the second comparison is between the ethnographers or anthropologists' language of description and analysis and the ethnographic data. What is a person and what is a plant if the two are being brought together like this? I can say that everywhere we find idioms of parents and children, but what on earth is a child and what on earth is a parent in these circumstances? And of course, the specificities matter. Anthropologists have been asking such questions for a long time. That's why I begin with a conventional kinship description from the Trobriands, which is in effect another internal comparison to remind us that in this case, one cannot comprehend what a mother is without also knowing what a father's sister is. Now, if you think that this is really a rather artificial way of setting it up, then you're spot on, you're absolutely correct. Because the task is how to get material on whose description one relies to also tell you something you didn't know about, say, parents and children. You have to creep up on it, so to speak, catch it unawares, which is what makes it so interesting to be thinking about Melanesian materials through Amazonian ones, or vice versa. But of course, there's a consequence. And then conveying this to the reader, you have to stage the material, in this case, to produce analogues internal to the argument. So, for example, an emphasis in one ethnographic account, for example, for the Amazonian Yawara parenting, the author produces the notion of parenting without procreation, and that suggests questions to ask of another context, this time a Melanesian context, and I refer to the Kowloon. Suppose we think about procreation without sex. So the one suggestion, parenting without procreation, leads to another. Well, can we think of procreation without sex? I should just say, though, I'm not going to be like our Prime Minister and say I have to be straight with you, because that's instantly a signal of not being straight. But I do have to admit that I'm relying on the reader's general understanding of regional complexity to appreciate my simplifications and selections. So I'm assuming an Amerindianist reader will realize that if it's obvious I've been highly selective for the region they're familiar with, then the same goes for what they may not know but can guess or infer about, say, Melanesia. Anyway, I think of this crabwise strategy as indirection. To get an understanding of an object, say object A, you might want to create positions from which to view it that you can't anticipate. In other words, you can't anticipate what you've seen until you've got to that position, B or C or whatever. Because if you go straight to A from where you are now, say if where you are now is X, then A will turn out to be what you already saw from X.
Yes, of course. And how plant life enables us to think about relational character of gender then?
Underlying all this in this particular paper, what I want to creep up on is what the internal analogies between persons and plants does to our understanding of gender relations, hence all the indirection, not to prejudge where gender relations might come into play. So in the opening example already springs gender on us. The moment in a Trobriand funeral when the deceased's body or likeness is reabsorbed back into its source in its father's maternal subclan, by contrast with its spiritual assimilation to its mother's maternal subclan. Later, we learn that Trobrianders divide yam tubers into sons destined for exchange, circulating between subclans, and daughters destined for replanting in the maternal subclan land. Now, gender relations are in fact explicit interests of all three of these Amerindianists, and that was actually part of my reason for drawing on them. What then becomes interesting is the unevenness with which gender difference may be emphasized. So I get the impression from Miller's account, for example, where gardeners may be called either mother or father, that each term is substitutable for the other. What does seem to be gendered are the different modalities of gardeners' relations with the master spirits who oversee the crops, according to whether the spirit in question is male or female. Now, gender indifference also accompanies one of the Melanesian cases, the one that comes from a place called Umier, a description of boy's initiation in which the boy is reborn as, or is seen to be the replacement of, an ancestor of the grandparental generation. And it doesn't matter whether the ancestor is on the father's or the mother's side. But we might note the recursive model here, because the consequence of that is that the reborn child is reborn as a parent to its own parent.
And just as different generations involve specific kinship generations, how would those extend to plants?
Mm-hmm. I think some of this has already come from what I've just been talking about, in which I've been trying to give you examples of indirection. But I have to confess that there's also a direction to this account that I want to make explicit, and I think that will, in a rather indirect way, answer your question. In the gender of the gift, I arrive at the theoretical formula, relations which separate. That is, seeing the relation as a device for creating distinctions, just as distinction may be the site of relations. And anybody who's worked on disjunctive synthesis will recognize what I'm saying. This came about for all kinds of reasons, and I elaborated it in all kinds of ways and developed other notions such as or applied other notions such as individual, or invented other notions such as the partible person, none of which had anything to do with plants. But one is always left worrying, of course, about extrapolating too far from the apparent ethnography. Anyway, I became interested in indigenous metaphors of cutting, so that the people I worked with talked of the bride being cut from her kin in Hagen, and in fact an analogy was made between the marriage and a celebration of the marriage and a funeral. And they also talked about cutting the deceased from the living. Then came the obvious realization from that visit in 2015, when I suddenly became aware of root crops, that the vegetative propagation of root crops implies cutting, either the corm or tuber itself, or else you as it were, separate in advance and make a division of the crop. But it's very interesting that in the Trobriand people, who plant whole tubers set aside for planting, those daughter tubers, you'll remember. Also, when they plant taro, cut the taro. Use cutting as a form of propagation there before the planting. There's another place I don't talk about in the paper on the Madang coast called Raiti, and Raiti people plant whole taro, that is little cormlets that grow around grow around the mother corm. They're called children cormlets. They plant them whole, but they cut their yams. They sever the heads of the yams in order to plant. Anyway, many other crops such as bananas require cutting in order to be prior to planting. Now, while Maitsa's account of Yarawara suggests a detailed attention to kinship relations in the life and spiritual transformation of plants, the analogies are often truncated in Melanesian accounts. So while birth is a very common idiom, no one imagines tubers being initiated or married. But now I know about how tubers and corms are cut. It's divided. Can I give more substance to my surmise, or will it have to be discarded? In other words, my surmise about the significance of cutting and division as metaphors for relations. So a new question, in relation to plants, what does cutting do and what kind of relation is created? Well, as indicated for the Ermier, it made a break, that is a relation, between the proximate generations of plantings, parent and child, which allows an elision similar to that of alternate generations of grandparent and grandchild. And the terminological equation of grandparent and grandchild is very common in that part of the world, as in many places. Now, when we talk of grandparent and grandchild, it looks as though like is being replaced with like, as in succession in a kin group. So if we take the perspective of plants, the replacement of persons by persons is like a tuber fragment planted and then a whole new tuber being lifted from the soil, its replacement. But if you take the perspective of persons, a lot else, in fact, has to happen for the child to become a parent. This is where all kinds of readjustments of relations has to take place, precisely through marriage, initiation, and so forth, all manners of separations and combinations of categories of persons. If we think about that aspect of kinship, what is happening then in the case of plants? And then this is just a speculation I have for the Melanesian material. But the point is that having thought about the people's kinship, one then perhaps might want to look again at what looks just like a sort of technical horticultural practice. Okay, so this is my speculation, is that the cut, in the case of the tuber or the corm, is a reorientation of a singular plant being into beings with different destinies, the part to be eaten, the part to be planted, what will die from what will live and then die again in giving birth. Analogous, perhaps, to initiation and marriage is the elaboration of relations between gardener and plant, that require ritual and magic, rules of abstention on the part of the gardener so the corm or tuber will grow, and so forth, although that's not actually in the paper. There are two very brief points to add, which aren't in the paper themselves, but one writes papers as platforms for thought and other papers. One is the interest of all this for discussions about domestication and what is now being speculated in terms of the early domestication of tropical cultivars, among other things, that in fact people's kinship practices may, as it were, be written into the very sort of steps that were taken in looking after and nurturing and killing and causing to die plants and people. And that is the second point, which is that in some of the interspecies discussions, not, I hasten to add, among the Amerindianists that I've come across, but elsewhere, kinship is very often rendered in Euro-American terms, so that it becomes a rather sort of cozy, amiable familiarity, being with plant species and so forth. And I think I'm really making a plea that if we're serious in drawing those analogies, we'd better know what kind of kinship is at issue. And I'm suggesting it's a kinship that places as much weight on the death and the termination of beings as it does on their springing back to life. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I'm really glad to have a last door or window opened to these ideas for new articles. I'm really looking forward to read them also. Thank you very much for your time. It's been really good to have you here.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. And I didn't say hello to everybody at the beginning, so I'll say thank you for bearing with me, and goodbye.